February 20th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. German tank crews gripped their controls, confident their Panzers were unbeatable. But as the desert fog lifted, something strange happened. American Shermans appeared, not scattered, not confused, but moving as if one brain controlled them all. Orders came fast, strikes landed faster, and German crews suddenly fought alone, blind, cut off from each other. The paradox was brutal. The more powerful tanks lost to the weaker ones, because the Shermans could talk. This was no accident. It was America's secret weapon, an invisible force the Germans never understood. Stay with me, because what happens next will change how you see World War II forever. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button and support this channel so we can bring you more hidden stories from history. It began not with steel, but with static. In the late 1930s, as Europe armed itself for inevitable war, the United States Army faced a quieter crisis. Its tanks were deaf. Armored vehicles were built in growing numbers, yet they spoke in fragments, their voices drowned by the roar of engines and the interference of crude AM radios. Crews pounded on turret walls with wrenches, shouted over the scream of gears, or used colored flags, methods that belonged more to the First World War than the next one. The paradox was stark. A modern army was being assembled with communication tools of the past. Into this gap stepped a group of unlikely revolutionaries. Daniel Noble, a professor at the University of Connecticut, Henryk Magnuski, a Polish engineer who had fled Europe, and the Galvin brothers of Motorola. They were not soldiers, yet their vision of frequency modulation, FM, promised clarity in a world of noise. In 1940, Noble sketched out a concept for a rugged vehicle-mounted FM system, where AM radios snapped, hissed, and blurred under the crackle of engines. FM would remain clear. Signal, not noise. Magnuski liked to say, and his crystal-controlled prototypes proved it. The US Army, often slow to embrace innovation, made an uncharacteristically bold decision. On July 22, 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, the War Department mandated that every medium tank would carry a standardized radio system, the SCR 508. This was not a suggestion. It was law by order. The U.S. Signal Corps was tasked with mass production. By the end of 1942, Motorola had already delivered thousands, and every Sherman rolling off the line came with a radio in its belly. It was a feat of standardization that the fractured German war economy, riddled with competing firms and doctrines, never achieved. Contrast this with the Wehrmacht. German panzer crews relied on the Fug 5, a serviceable AM set that functioned well under ideal conditions, but faltered in battle. Only commanders carried radios, subordinate tanks often had none at all. Orders filtered down by hand signals, flares, or guesswork. In theory, it kept formations tight and obedient. In practice, it created hesitation, isolation, and deadly silence at the worst possible moments. One German veteran would later write, "We fought as individuals in iron boxes, while the Americans fought as one machine." The sensory difference was astonishing. Inside a Sherman, the world was a cacophony. The 9-cylinder Continental engine roaring, the treads clattering against stone, the turret grinding as it traversed. Yet through padded headphones, a clear voice could cut through. Red 2, advance left. Red 3, hold position. The intercom system, the BC 606, let every man in the tank hear and be heard, from driver to loader. In an era when most armies treated crews as replaceable cogs, this network gave every soldier a voice. Production numbers told the same story. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 49,000 Shermans rolled off assembly lines, and virtually everyone carried its SCR 508. Motorola alone delivered over 50,000 FM sets. By contrast, German production struggled to keep pace with replacement needs, and even late in the war, many Panzers rolled into battle without full communication gear. It was not just a technological gap, it was an organizational chasm. And yet in 1942, no German soldier standing across from a Sherman could see the secret. The radios were hidden inside, their antennas no different than those of a truck or command car. The irony would play out on the battlefield when formations of Shermans began to move with uncanny precision. Where the Germans saw chance, coordination, or luck, the truth was electromagnetic. This was not propaganda, it was reality. And as the first Shermans landed in North Africa, the world would soon discover what it meant when tanks could truly talk to one another. A Sherman tank was never silent. Inside, the air quivered with vibration, the oily tang of hot metal mixing with sweat and exhaust. Crews lived in a storm of sound, clanging shells, rattling suspension, and the steady growl of the engine. Yet in the midst of that chaos, a new kind of order whispered into their ears, the calm, clipped voice of the SCR 508 radio system. For the first time in history, armored warfare had something beyond armor and firepower. It had clarity. At its core, the SCR 508 was deceptively simple. The system revolved around the BC 604 transmitter, a 25-watt unit designed to broadcast on fixed FM channels between 20 and 27.9 MHz. Its heart was crystal control, quartz elements that locked each frequency in place with a stability that German AM sets could not match. Alongside it sat two BC 603 receivers, each capable of monitoring different channels simultaneously. One handled the battalion or company net, the other kept a tank commander linked to his immediate platoon. What this meant was revolutionary. A commander could coordinate with higher headquarters while still keeping the pulse of his own unit. The entire system tied together with the BC 606 intercom. To modern ears, this may seem trivial, but in the 1940s, it was transformative. Every crew member, driver, gunner, loader, commander, had a throat microphone and padded headphones. Orders no longer had to be screamed over the deafening clatter of treads. One tanker later remembered, "You could whisper, and the man in the driver's seat would hear you. That made us a team, not just bodies crammed in a steel box." The difference between FM and AM was more than technical jargon. It was the difference between life and death. German Fug, 5 sets, transmitting on amplitude modulation, were plagued by static and engine noise. Tank radios became nearly useless, the moment tracks churned over gravel or engines revved under stress. Worse, AM signals bounced wildly in urban areas or valleys, making coordination unreliable. FM, however, rejected most of this interference. Frequency modulation produced a steady, clean voice, largely immune to atmospheric noise and ignition sparks. American crews could drive into battle with engines roaring and still maintain crystal-clear communication. Statistics underline the gap. A single BC 604 transmitter could maintain reliable contact for up to 8 miles, even through terrain clutter. With careful relay, battalions could stretch networks across 30 miles. German Fugi 5 sets claimed similar ranges, but only in laboratory conditions. On muddy battlefields, practical ranges often dropped to 2 or 3 miles, and even then, clarity was fleeting. The paradox sharpened. German engineers had built tanks with thicker armor and heavier guns, yet their crews fought alone. Americans built tanks that were, on paper, inferior in protection and firepower, but those tanks never fought in silence. The SCR 508 was not flawless. Early versions overheated in desert climates, and batteries drained faster than expected during long operations. Antenna placement on Shermans, usually a whip mast near the turret, made them vulnerable to enemy fire. Crews improvised with spares, or mounted auxiliary masts on engine decks to keep the net alive. But these were minor inconveniences compared to the complete breakdowns common in German sets when subjected to mud, sand, or vibration. Witness voices confirm the impact. Lieutenant Colonel Charles B. R. Kelly of the U.S. Armored Force wrote in 1943, "The new FM sets permit command to be exercised in a manner hitherto impossible. Units maneuver as if one brain were directing many arms." German after-action reports echoed the frustration from the other side. One Panzer officer complained, "They seemed to know where we were before we even moved. Our own messages were lost in the storm of static." Sensory details mattered here. Imagine a Sherman platoon leader, his headphones warm against his temples, hearing not just noise but words. Pivot, left 200 yards. Hold fire, wait for my mark. Outside, the battlefield screamed. Inside, a line of thought connected 5 tanks like fingers on a hand. No wonder German soldiers described Sherman movements as eerily synchronized. And yet this was only the prelude. The radios were ready. The Shermans were built. The stage was set. When American armor landed in North Africa, the Germans would finally see what it meant when machines of war could truly speak. November 8, 1942. Dawn broke over the Moroccan coast in a haze of salt and smoke. Operation Torch had begun, the first great Anglo-American gamble of the war. As landing craft scraped against the surf and tanks rumbled onto hostile soil, German and Vichy observers expected a slow, clumsy assault. American armor, they believed, was green and ill-prepared. What they witnessed instead was a paradox. Tanks that looked ordinary, even inferior, but moved with uncanny coordination, as though guided by an unseen hand. The Sherman, with its 75 mm gun and medium armor, did not frighten German tankers. On paper, the Panzer III and Ivu could match or outgun it. What unsettled them was how Shermans operated as groups rather than individuals. Reports from the field noted that platoons advanced, halted and pivoted in unison. They seemed to wheel like cavalry, recalled Sergeant Ernst Kruger of the 10th Panzer Division, stunned by the synchronicity. The secret was invisible. The SCR 508 network humming beneath steel hulls, threading voices together in real time. The first true clash revealed both promise and weakness. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, inexperienced American commanders mishandled their armor. Poor tactics and scattered defenses gave the Germans a sharp victory. Yet buried inside that defeat lay a revelation. Even as units broke and retreated, small Sherman groups fought cohesively, regrouping faster than German intelligence thought possible. Tankers called to each other over the radios, sharing enemy positions, adjusting fire, and covering withdrawals. German crews, by contrast, often lost contact once formations scattered. One panzer could not find another, remembered a Wehrmacht radio operator, because static swallowed us whole. The paradox deepened. The Germans won the battle, but it was here that they first glimpsed the American advantage. Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, staff officer for Arracourt Corps, later wrote, "Their tanks were poor, but their communication was excellent." It was as if every crew fought with the eyes of the commander. For an army trained in blitzkrieg's choreography, it was a bitter irony to be outmaneuvered in its own art. Inside the Sherman, the sensory world told the story better than any report. Drivers felt the vibration of orders as much as they heard them, the commander's calm voice in their headsets cutting through the engine's thunder. Hold here, pivot, right, enemy, at 2 o'clock. Gunners adjusted elevation while loaders counted rounds, all connected by the BC 606 intercom. No more banging on turret walls, no more misheard shouts. Crews later recalled that it gave them confidence, a sense of being part of something larger. Numbers reinforced the picture. During Torch, over 400 Shermans were deployed across multiple landing zones, nearly all equipped with radios. By contrast, many of the French and German tanks they faced had no such standardization. A battalion of Shermans could talk across 30 miles of desert if needed, while enemy forces often relied on visual signals once the air crackled with interference. German intelligence officers tried to explain the phenomenon. Some assumed Americans had rehearsed meticulously. Others blamed Allied air superiority for coordinating tank movements. Few guessed that the real advantage was humming inside every Sherman hull. By the time they realized the truth, production lines in the United States were already pushing out thousands more radios each month. Still, North Africa showed that technology alone was not enough. At Kasserine, radios could not compensate for poor leadership. General Omar Bradley would later insist that training and doctrine had to catch up to equipment, but once they did, the combination proved lethal. What the Germans saw in Tunisia was only the beginning. The next campaign, through the mountains of Italy, would test not just men and machines, but the very limits of electromagnetic warfare. September 9, 1943. Salerno, Italy. The sea lay behind the Allied beachhead, but ahead stretched a country built for ambush. Villages clung to ridges, roads snaked through ravines, and every rise seemed to conceal a German gun. For the Americans, this was no longer the open desert of North Africa. It was a maze. Tanks risked isolation at every bend. Yet here too the paradox endured. In terrain designed to break armies apart, the Sherman's radio net bound them together. The SCR 508 faced its harshest test. Mountains were notorious radio killers. German commanders trusted geography to do their work, confident that American sets would fade into static once ridgelines intervened. But FM surprised them. While AM signals ricocheted wildly and dissolved into unintelligible echoes, FM's tighter bandwidth and capture effect meant voices often punched through, not perfectly but far more clearly than German Fug 5 SES could manage. A Sherman platoon winding through a valley could still hear its commander above the hiss of multipath distortion. It was not flawless, but it was enough to keep cohesion where the Germans expected chaos. An infantry officer attached to the 36th Division recalled the experience. The tanks never vanished. You could turn a corner, think you were alone, and then a voice crackled back. Red 2, we're here with you. It made the difference between pushing on and freezing in fear. By contrast, German accounts tell of platoons disappearing into hillsides, unable to call for help. One captured radio log from the Hermann Göring Division recorded only fragments, half sentences swallowed by interference, unanswered pleas for artillery support. Statistics underscore the contrast. By late 1943, the US had fielded over 20,000 SCR 508 sets across theaters. German production of 5 sets lagged so badly that many tanks in Italy entered battle with no radios at all, relying instead on colored flags or messengers darting between vehicles. In mountain fighting, those couriers were often cut down before they could deliver their orders. The Wehrmacht, once master of maneuver, was being undone by silence. The sensory reality was striking. Imagine sitting inside a Sherman halfway up Monte Cassino, rain hammering on the hull, mud clinging to tracks. The radio hisses, then a calm voice cuts through. Enemy gun, stone house, left flank. The gunner swivels, fires, and the threat is gone. A platoon leader later wrote, "It was like having a sixth sense, a voice that saw for you." Meanwhile, German crews nearby strained to catch words lost in static, often turning too late or not at all. Paradox sharpened again. Germany built some of the strongest defensive positions of the war in Italy, yet their own tanks stumbled within them. Americans, supposedly bogged down by inferior armor, leveraged radios to maneuver in terrain that should have favored the defender. One German officer bitterly remarked after Salerno, "They made the mountains speak." The lessons of Italy hardened Allied doctrine. Training emphasized constant communication, redundancy, and cross-branch coordination. Field manuals encouraged tankers to maintain dual nets, linking infantry and artillery whenever possible. Engineers worked to improve antennas and extend range. By the winter of 1943, the US Army was already adapting its electromagnetic advantage into a doctrine of combined arms. But Italy was only a proving ground. The true crucible would come in the fields of France, where hedgerows created a new kind of battlefield, one that could blind and trap tanks as surely as mountains. And there, the paradox of American radios would cut both ways. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The sea was a wall of steel and fire as the greatest armada in history struck Hitler's fortress Europe. Amid the thunder of naval guns and the drone of aircraft, hundreds of Sherman tanks clawed their way ashore. For American crews, it was a day of paradoxes, the triumph of reaching the beaches and the terror of what came after, the hedgerows of Normandy, ancient earthworks that turned every field into a fortress. The SCR 508 radios that had proven so effective in deserts and mountains now faced an unexpected test. Dense hedges, some centuries old, blocked line of sight and reduced effective range. Tank units that had grown accustomed to steady nets suddenly found themselves shouting over clipped signals. Coordination grew difficult, and in that vacuum came the most dangerous irony of all: friendly fire. Infantrymen advancing alongside Shermans had their own radios, the SCR-300 walkie-talkie sets, but these operated on different frequencies than the tank-mounted SCR-508S. A squad leader under fire could not simply call into a tank for immediate help. Instead, messages had to be relayed through command posts, adding precious minutes to responses. In the chaos of hedgerow fighting, this gap cost lives. Sergeant James O'Hara of the 4th Infantry Division remembered bitterly, "You'd be 20 feet from a tank, waving your arms, and they couldn't hear you. They had radios, we had radios, but the damn things couldn't talk to each other." Numbers tell the scale of the problem. In the first 2 weeks after D-Day, nearly 150 incidents of friendly fire between US armor and infantry were logged, many due to miscommunication. German defenders, by contrast, exploited the hedgerows with deadly efficiency, knocking out over 2,000 Allied vehicles in the first month. The paradox was cruel. America had the most advanced tank radios in the world, yet their advantage was muted by the silence between branches. The sensory reality was brutal. Imagine the smell of crushed hedges, sweet and choking under the summer sun. A Sherman pushes forward, its turret brushing branches, visibility cut to a few feet. Inside, the commander hears his net buzzing with clipped orders: Red 1, contact, static. Then gunfire erupts, and suddenly infantry ahead is mistaken for the enemy. Smoke grenades billow, shouts rise, but the inter-branch silence lingers until someone braves the open to bang on the tank's armor. Necessity, however, breeds innovation. By July, field modifications spread rapidly. One was the infantry telephone, an EE-8 field phone bolted to the rear of Sherman hulls, wired directly into the BC-606 intercom. Now a soldier could run to a tank, pick up the handset, and speak directly to the crew inside. It was crude, exposed to fire, but it worked. Infantrymen who had once cursed tanks as blind giants now praised the lifeline. Private Harold Finch wrote home, "It's like talking to God, you whisper into the box and the tank listens." The Americans adapted faster than the Germans could counter. By late June, infantry-tank cooperation improved dramatically. Radios once thought to be limited by hedgerows became part of a layered system. FM for armor coordination, field phones for close infantry support, and SCR-300 SAD tied into command nets. Still, the hedgerows left scars. Tankers learned that radios could not solve every problem. Sometimes steel met earth, and the ancient landscape itself muted technology. But the Americans were learning, and with every adaptation they tightened their grip. By July's end, the Allies were preparing a breakout that would test their radio networks on a scale never before attempted. The code name was Operation Cobra, and this time, radios would not just guide platoons or companies. They would coordinate entire divisions moving as one. July 25, 1944, Normandy shook beneath a storm of steel. More than 3,000 Allied aircraft dropped 4,000 tons of bombs on German defences west of Saarloh, the thunder rolling for hours until the earth itself seemed to shudder. Then, as the dust settled, the Shermans moved. For the first time in the war, an armoured assault would be guided not merely by sight and sound, but by an invisible network of voices. Operation Cobra was the Allies' breakout, a gamble to shatter the Bocage stalemate. It demanded coordination on a scale the Wehrmacht believed impossible. Infantry, armour, artillery and air power advancing in concert across a narrow corridor. The paradox was clear. German tanks were stronger. German soldiers were dug into near impenetrable defences. Yet it was the Americans, often derided as inexperienced or reliant on material abundance, who would choreograph an attack of near-surgical precision. The conductor's baton was the radio. Sherman crews tuned their SCR-508 SIRs into battalion nets, while commanders monitored division frequencies. Some tanks carried additional sets to liaise with artillery observers or liaison aircraft. FM stability meant that even amid the electromagnetic chaos of hundreds of transmitters, messages came through with clarity. A platoon leader could call for a timed artillery strike, advance his tanks, and synchronize with infantry, all in minutes. German reports later described the assault as orchestrated thunder. Statistics tell the scale. By Cobra, US forces had deployed over 1,500 Sherman tanks, nearly all radio-equipped. Signal Corps records list more than 20,000 FM sets operating in the Normandy theatre by late July. German defenders, though experienced, faced severe shortages. Panzer brigades often entered combat with only command tanks wired for radio, the rest relied on following visual cues. In the chaos of Cobra's bombardment, those cues vanished. Sensory detail defined the moment. Tankers remembered the ground trembling beneath treads as they advanced through gaps blasted by bombers. Engines roared, hedgerows splintered, and dust stung the eyes. Yet inside their headphones, voices were steady. Forward 100 yards. Enemy position left, prepare hete. The contrast was stark. Outside, chaos. Inside, orchestration. A Sherman gunner later said, "It felt like someone had turned the battle into a drill. We knew where to go, when to fire, what to hit." On the German side, silence reigned. Survivors of Panzer Lehr Division recalled the disintegration of their nets under bombing. Cables were cut. AM radios failed amid interference, and subordinate tanks fought blind. One officer confessed, "We could not tell who lived and who died. We fought as islands, while the Americans fought as one." Cobra's breakthrough was astonishing. In just 4 days, Allied armor advanced more than 20 miles, rupturing the German front. Entire divisions were encircled or annihilated. Friendly fire incidents, though still present, dropped significantly due to improved tank infantry coordination. E-8 telephones bolted to Sherman hulls became lifelines. Infantrymen no longer waved helplessly at advancing tanks. They picked up a handset and spoke. The paradox sharpened into a revelation. American Shermans, derided for thin armor and weaker guns, became devastating not because of what they were individually, but because of what they became together. Radios turned them from solitary machines into a single organism, moving with a unity the Wehrmacht could neither predict nor match. And yet, Cobra was not the final test. That would come in September, at a small French village named Arracourt. There, in fog and mud, the question would be settled: could radios and coordination truly overcome Germany's best armoured divisions? September 19, 1944. Lorraine, France. The fog lay heavy, muffling sound and cloaking the ridgelines. Out of the grey mist rolled German Panthers, sleek, heavily armoured, armed with the dreaded 75 mm Kohler K-42 gun. On paper, they outclassed every Sherman in range, in armour, in firepower. Yet by the end of 3 weeks of fighting around the village of Arracourt, the paradox was undeniable. The inferior Shermans had destroyed 281 German armoured vehicles, losing only 41 of their own. The secret was not steel, but signal. The US 4th Armoured Division faced elements of Germany's freshly raised Panzer brigades. The German plan was straightforward: smash through thin American lines with superior tanks and drive to cut supply routes. But the execution faltered immediately. German Panthers rolled forward without coherent communication. Fog blinded visual signals. AM radios broke down under interference, and command tanks quickly became priority targets. Once they were hit, subordinate tanks stumbled like decapitated limbs. The Americans, by contrast, turned the fog into an ally. Every Sherman was a node in the SCR 508 network, each crew reporting, receiving, and responding in real time. Platoons scattered by terrain still moved as if linked by invisible wires. A company commander later recalled, "Even when I couldn't see my own men, I could hear them. One tank spotted a Panther. Seconds later, artillery was on it." The numbers reveal the gulf. German Forg 5 transmitters offered barely 10 watts of AM power. Range in motion rarely exceeded a kilometer. American BC 604 sets pushed 25 watts of FM clarity with reliable transmission at 7 to 10 miles. Dual BC 603 receivers let commanders monitor both platoon and company nets. This meant a Sherman could spot a target, relay coordinates, and within minutes bring down a curtain of fire from artillery or tank destroyers. The sensory details tell the story of imbalance. German tankers, buttoned up in their iron fortresses, heard static hissing through their headsets, drowning out orders. American tankers, though cramped and deafened by engine roar, heard clear voices in their headphones. Throat mics transmitted even in the din of combat. It was like fighting blind men, one Sherman crewman remembered. We weren't stronger, but we could see through each other's eyes. The paradox deepened as battles unfolded. Panthers ambushed Shermans at close range, only to be counter-ambushed by other Shermans forewarned over the net. German brigades, built on the belief that armor superiority ensured victory, watched their formations collapse as piecemeal assaults were cut down by coordinated American fire. After-action reports stunned both sides. The Americans tallied kill ratios approaching 7-1, an outcome no one would have predicted from comparing specifications. German intelligence, puzzled, attributed the American success to rigid discipline and thorough training, never realizing the true culprit was electromagnetic. They still targeted Shermans with multiple antennas, convinced only command tanks could transmit. The irony was brutal. By 1944, every Sherman could call artillery, every Sherman could assume command. Arracourt proved a turning point. The Panther, hailed as a triumph of German engineering, had met its equal not in another machine but in a system of communication. It was the living demonstration that information, not armor, was the real high ground of modern warfare. But as fall turned to winter, American forces would take this advantage even further. The battles at the Rhine would showcase not just tactical proof but strategic transformation, entire armies moving as one, coordinated through radio waves invisible to the enemy. March 1945. The Rhine River, swollen with spring melt, marked the last great barrier into the heart of Germany. Pontoon bridges groaned under the weight of Shermans, half-tracks, and endless convoys of supply trucks. The air smelled of wet earth and gasoline, the riverbanks trembling under artillery fire. Yet through the chaos, orders flowed with uncanny speed, divisions maneuvering as if guided by a single hand. The paradox was clear. Germany had built tanks to dominate the battlefield, but America had built radios to dominate the war. By now, the full integration of communications was visible everywhere, from regimental HQs to individual Sherman crews. The U.S. Army fought like a connected organism. Engineers laid field cables, artillery fire missions were relayed within minutes, and armored columns adjusted in real time to shifting threats. One officer recalled in a post-war interview, "I could pick up a handset and redirect an entire battalion. The Germans never had that power. Their tanks fought battles. Ours fought wars." Hard numbers underline the truth. Between 1942 and 1945, the US produced over 250,000 radios for armored units, a scale unmatched in history. By comparison, German Fugue sets remained scarce, with priority given to command vehicles. Many Wehrmacht units entered combat with less than half of their tanks fitted with working transmitters. In effect, American doctrine democratized command, while German doctrine centralized it, and when leaders were killed or signals jammed, the difference became catastrophic. The sensory paradox lingered in memory. German tankers described the silence inside their steel beasts, static, broken phrases, hand signals, through narrow vision slits. American veterans recalled the opposite, a steady hum of voices, a chorus of guidance in their ears. One Sherman commander said years later, "The radio was our armor. You felt you were never alone." This was not propaganda, it was reality. The Sherman was derided as undergunned, underarmored, even expendable. Yet coupled with FM radios, it became a force multiplier that outmaneuvered the Panther and Tiger alike. Technology, once invisible, reshaped the battlefield as surely as armor plating or high-velocity shells. As Germany crumbled, the lesson grew wider. Armies learned that speed of information was more decisive than sheer firepower. The legacy extended far beyond the war. NATO doctrine, Cold War strategies, Even the digital networks of the 21st century trace their lineage to the invisible threads woven across Normandy hedgerows and Lorraine fog. The Germans had come as conquerors, believing their machines would dictate history. They left as students of a bitter truth: tanks without voices were giants with broken ears. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs nor its armor, but its abundance of connection, a chorus of men bound by invisible wires.